Hello and welcome to the Microbiome podcast. I'm Dr. Siobhan McCormack.
And I'm Dr. Sheena Fraser, and we're your co-hosts.
We are both GPs and lifestyle medics with a shared passion for microbiome science. We'll be translating the evidence and packaging it into actionable, bite-sized chunks so that you could harness the power of the microbiome to improve your own health and that of your patients. Now, the term gut health is everywhere in the food and supplement industry, social media channels, news, magazines, and of course, academic publications. But to date, the term has been very poorly defined and very much tied in our imagination to the gut microbiome and general wellness. Now, gut health is also commercially important, with the gut health industry reported as being worth up to $50 billion, according to some reports. So what exactly is gut health? Well, here to help us wade through these murky waters is a world expert on the subject, the wonderful Professor Maria Marco. Professor Marco, welcome.
Thank you so much.
I wonder if you can start, Maria, by introducing yourself to the listeners, telling them who you are and the positions you hold.
Sure. So I'm a professor in the Department of Food Science Technology at the University of California, Davis. And I'm also currently the president of the board for the International Scientific Association for Probiotics and Prebiotics, or ISAPP for short. And that is a all-volunteer board and nonprofit dedicated to really advancing the science of biotics. I'm a microbiologist by training. My day-to-day is studying microbes in foods and in our digestive tracts. And I'm really curious to understand if and how these microbes can help us and support our health.
Right. Well, let's dive right in. You had congratulations on this wonderful Nature Reviews paper, which is published, I think, in 2025. Can you tell us, just start by saying how you define gut health and also a bit about why you felt it was needed?
Sure. Just to start by saying, it's just not me. We had a panel of 13 experts, but I'm going to tell you the definition we came up with. It is a state of normal gastrointestinal function without active gastrointestinal disease and gut-related symptoms that affect the quality of life. So I'm sure we'll break that down. But you also asked why. Why would we come up with a definition? And I think you positioned this very nicely with your introduction. It's like we're hearing this term all the time now in marketing, and commercials, and even I use it and describing the work we do. But it really came down to thinking about how we would discuss gut health in a scientific context, in what sort of measures or tests we would include to determine somebody's gut health. And that really led to conversations with other scientists, clinicians on what this means, and led to that snowball effect of putting a bunch of experts together in the room and to talk about what does this mean?
Now, this was under the umbrella of ISAPP, which you've already introduced. Why did ISAPP take on this considerable sort of quest?
That's a great question. And I questioned it myself and bringing this idea forward to the board. And what convinced me is that ISAPP is the place to do it is that the term gut health was coined by companies selling prebiotics. And they had done some consumer research back in the late 90s, early 2000s, and realized that the term gut health could be a great way to communicate how dietary fibers, prebiotics can be beneficial through modulating our gut microbiome, and the term gut health resonated. So being ISAPP and interested to understand the biology of prebiotics, and we took this on.
Okay, so would you like to just state your final definition and then explain how long it took to come up with this and how many people were involved and what the process was?
Yeah, so the definition is a state of normal gastrointestinal function without active gastrointestinal disease and gut-related symptoms that affect quality of life. We really went into this discussion, and again, it was not just me, microbiologist, but dietitians, clinicians, pediatrician, gastroenterologist, immunologist, experts in neurobiology. So we really tried to have as diverse of a panel as we could, but with, a quorum of people who, we get too large, then we knew it would be a real challenge. We really went into it, though, not expecting to define it. A very important person we had on the panel was Stefan Bischoff, who's a gastroenterologist practicing in Germany. And he first attempted to define gut health back in 2011 in a perspective paper. And again, 2011, right? That's a long time ago. And he was, I think, pioneering in giving this commentary. And since that time, in the scientific literature, gut health had been mainly discussed, and most recently related to the gut microbiome. So synonymous with the gut microbiome, but we know it's much more than that. So he was there and open to talking about the definition. And then what we realized as the panel discussion went on, that we had a lot of agreement on what are the key components of the domains of gut health, gut microbiome being one, but also the immune system, endocrine systems, different cell types and domains of our GI tract, but also the individual experience, how we live day to day, like the symptoms that are so commonly shared amongst us that have to be included in a definition to make it really not just some academic exercise, but something we would practice from day to day.
Yeah, I must say, as a family doctor, I was very pleased to see that you had patient-reported symptoms in there. But it does cause some issues because sometimes, for example, in inflammatory bowel disease, the patient-reported symptoms don't equate with some of the biomarkers of this disorder. And, I find in general practice as well that some people with, very high inflammatory markers who've got terrible symptoms seem oddly calm and accepting of their symptoms, and other people who've had all their tests are normal and actually they're, in a normal state at the present time and it's well controlled with medications or lifestyle, they still report lots of symptoms. What are your thoughts about that, and how did you deal with that?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was a major point of discussion with the gastroenterologists and general practitioners, to bring in the lived experience into this. And we acknowledge in the paper that you could have, as you describe, absolutely no symptoms, but metrics of dysfunction, and vice versa, as you point out, that be no metrics of dysfunction, but symptoms. And I think that's a very humbling perspective because it shows how much more we have to learn.
Now, the other thing I loved, as well as the inclusion of the patient-reported symptoms, was the idea that you could have gut health and still have a diagnosis of a gut disorder. And can you talk a little bit around that? Because a lot of people, if they're asked if they're in good health, if they have a condition, they feel obliged to say, well, obviously not, because I have a diagnosis. So how did you look at that aspect?
Well, in the situation where a person has no symptoms and is in remission, where those metrics we would use for the diagnosis are within the normal range, then that was our recommendation. That person could say they have gut health or good gut health.
I think that's brilliant, because it's just, there's so much sort of, hope, and it's very motivating for people to sort of understand that they can, even if they don't have perfect gut health, that they can be moving along that journey towards gut health, even if they have a relapse. You're talking about a fewer frequencies of relapses, less severe relapse, and that all that is important as well. So it was really nice to see that there. The other interesting thing, you did mention that there were 6 domains that you divided it into, and you've already mentioned, which we'll get back to, the gut microbiome. And I'm glad that we haven't dived straight into that, because that is the thing on social media. It seems to equate in people's mind to gut health. The result of your stool microbiome analysis will tell you whether you have gut health or not, which is very far from the truth, as we will discuss. But you've also got digestive physiology, so the gastric motor function and secretions as well, gut barrier function, which I want to ask you about. You've mentioned immune function, and then there's metabolism. But I'm going to move straight on to this very complex area, which you've included, I'm pleased to see, the gut-brain axis. Can you tell me why you included the gut-brain axis and why you didn't include, for example, the gut-liver axis or the gut-skin axis and all those other connections between the gut and various organs?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I've been asked this before, and I do want to just qualify that I see that this concept will continue to evolve. The gut-brain axis was important to include because so much of our symptomology is coming from that connection, right? How we feel. And after eating, feeling full, feeling bloated, having pain, that's all, of course, coming through those signals from the digestive tract to the brain. And we felt it was critical to include because of that. It's almost impossible to disassociate the two, right? Because we wouldn't know if there's a problem if we don't feel it and through those signals that reach our brain. Another facet of this is that we really tried to stay local to the kind of connections we have in our digestive tract. Of course, the digestion itself, but also the signals that are generated through hormone production or in our the endocrine cells lining our digestive tract, our immune system. Not to say the gut-liver axis isn't relevant, but there is that connection through the digestion process that we didn't call it out.
So if we could just talk about biomarkers, this is really difficult. And one of the reasons why I struggle with this, in the NHS, none of these biomarkers are available, except for the usual full blood count, biochemical panels, C-reactive protein, and then some tests for colorectal cancer. But there are a whole plethora of potential tests. And certainly in the private world, where there's direct-to-consumer testing, a lot of these are available. But if we could just pick a couple of the ones that perhaps you're more familiar with. So I don't know if you would do in your research short-chain fatty acids, stool analysis. Would that be something you would be doing? And how valuable is that?
Yes, so that's something we do in our human studies and research, but really we realize they're not clinical biomarkers. Unless you have a gastrointestinal infections like C. Clostridium difficile, this nosocomial pathogen, right? You're looking for specific pathogens. That makes sense. We don't have the fundamental understanding at a level that to do a fecal microbiome test or short-chain fatty acid test is going to give you a diagnosis or kind of a path forward for how to improve your health. I think we could say, have more fiber, and we'd see that maybe some enrichment of those fiber-degrading microbes we know are good for us. But I think we would just know that in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, one of the arguments I put forward is, does it actually make any difference to your management? So, yes, I mean, the listeners are well aware of short-chain fatty acids, which are produced by the fermentation of plant fibers ingested in the diet by your gut microbiome bacteria. And it's generally thought that high levels, high production of short-chain fatty acids are thought to be beneficial in most circumstances. And I suppose what they're doing with this is taking a stool sample and measuring the levels of short-chain fatty acids with the presumption, which may be wrong, that if you have a high level in your stool, that's a good thing, or whether it's butyrate, or propionate, or acetate. But I'm imagining there are some circumstances where a high level of short-chain fatty acids in your stool might, for example, imply that you're not utilizing it well, or there could be other reasons why it's all going out in your stool, not being absorbed,
right,
or used by the epithelium. Therefore, that could be a negative thing.
Yeah, precisely. So what we measure in fecal samples will be whatever is not absorbed or used by our intestine cells. So it's an easy thing to measure because you can get a lot of stool. And it is still an area of active study, so we may have better metrics in the future, but I don't see us relying on this to give us a good idea of actually what is happening in the digestive tract.
This podcast is funded by the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine. The BSLM is an independent charity set up to promote the role of lifestyle medicine in improving people's health and well-being. We empower healthcare professionals to support patients to prevent, manage, and even reverse many chronic conditions through education and connection to our like-minded community. Shiv and I are both members of the BSLM and certified lifestyle medicine practitioners. We authored our first course, The Fundamentals of Gut Microbiome Science, for BSLM. This podcast was created with the aim of improving education on the role of human microbiomes. For those keen on doing a deeper dive, please check out the course on the BSLM Learning Academy page. Listeners to this podcast can access a 10% discount with code MBM10. We're also able to offer all healthcare professional listeners 50% off the first year of membership, unlocking a free overview course and nearly £100 off annual conference tickets, using the code MICROBM in capitals. Now let's get back to the show.
I suppose I'm interested, having been a family doctor for over 30 years, the landscape has just dramatically changed. Decades ago, we wouldn't even be discussing these. They wouldn't be part of a possible panel that people could even think about ordering. They'd still be used in research and be worked up by academics before being released onto the unsuspecting public. Lots of my friends and colleagues are asking me about these tests. Should they get their stool analysis done? Should they get these tests done? There's just a huge number of them with very different, research and scientific backgrounds to how helpful they are. Plus the labs that are doing them vary in the way that they do the testing as well, and whether they're regulated or not. They're also quite expensive. And this idea that a one-off stool analysis is just a photo in time, and the next week you might have a completely different photo. So I just wonder, because this is an exploding area, and I'm trying to balance and be fair to how I think about it, because I like the idea that people are taking their health into their own hands and taking responsibility. And of course, if they wish to spend their money in certain areas, that's their right to do that. But it's just how we guide people through this, because it does seem that a lot of people are getting not just their microbiome analysis done in terms of their taxonomic data, but also all these other potential biomarkers in the stool. Have you got any thoughts about that, or do you get asked about that?
Yeah, I think it's a curiosity, and I certainly, it's just to know what life is living inside me. And as we understand more about the functions that these microbes do for us, like digest fiber or protein or make vitamins, I believe these tests are really going to improve and are going to be able to say, Maria, you're missing this particular vitamin. So, we're still a ways off from that, but I see the field converging around this concept of not just who's there or the diversity metrics, but really what services do they provide? And then we can come up with the better tests from there. For now, there may be some clinical utility, particularly if somebody is having persistent GI issues. You have to look for these pathogens. But otherwise, it could be just fun to know.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, it does seem to have ignited the population's imagination. These creatures which we can't see, and I know that you've devoted your life's work to this area, so that's fantastic. And another area that you're very well known for is your work in fermented food. And there was another very important consensus paper where, again, you were trying to shine a light on and define fermented food. Could you just tell us a little bit about, again, what your approach was, why you decided to do that, and what the final definition was that the team, and I know that you talk about consensus paper, came up with?
The fermented foods topic, I suppose, kind of came about in a similar way that it's a topic of discussion in the U.S. and I know in other parts of the world, particularly during COVID. There was we were all making sourdough bread at home or sauerkraut, and then kombucha is very popular these days. And alongside the growth of interest in our human microbiome, people are starting to realize, our foods contain microbes. And alongside that idea is coming out that fermented foods contain probiotics. And I see probiotics as something different than the microbes in fermented foods. So we came back to ISAPP and we took up this discussion. I mentioned prebiotics first, so I'm going to explain what they are. These are compounds or metabolites that we typically will ingest that feed the good microbes in our gut. So I'm not giving the actual definition, but these are basically foods for our microbiome. And the understanding is that like a prebiotic like inulin or fructooligosaccharides or galactooligosaccharides, when we eat it, reaches our colon and feeds the good microbes like bifidobacteria that grow and make short-chain fatty acids and other compounds that support our health. And probiotics are something very different. These are microorganisms, so bacteria mainly, but there's one yeast strain that's being used, so fungi, that when we apply and they're alive in sufficient amounts, confer a health benefit. So instead of relying on the microbes on our body, we're going to provide them. And a fermented food is a food or a beverage that is made through microbial growth and enzymatic activity. So their metabolism and changing the ingredients in the food, like flour or cabbage, milk, into something else, right? Some other, we know of like a difference between yogurt and milk and cheese, right? They taste, they look different. And that is all because of the microbes.
So you're saying that probiotics, in the definition, you have to have a health benefit, a proven health benefit, presumably through a randomized controlled trial, at least one. And fermented food, you're saying it can have live bacteria, but doesn't have to. And it can have health benefits, but it doesn't have to. Would that be correct?
Exactly.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here. So I'm a lifestyle medic and we're trying to move away from pharma, and I don't want to replace big pharma with big biotics. I huge respect for medications. I will be the first in the queue for antibiotics if I have a pneumonia or if I need it. But it's just this, rebalancing the emphasis on lifestyle practices and adding, biotics and pharmaceuticals on and off this rock of lifestyle behavior, as and when we need it. So my colleagues at the British Society of Lifestyle Medicine, they say to me, look, Siobhan, Everyone's talking about gut health and the gut microbiome, and they're moving straight on to biotics. And they say, well, look, why can't we just do fermented food? There are a high number of live microbes in many fermented dairy products. It's likely that they're good for your health. So why don't we tell people just to use that rather than probiotics? What would be your response to those sort of questions?
Yeah, I would say that we're still in a phase of trial and error. You might want to try a probiotic, but maybe just eating yogurt is sufficient for you and gives you the benefits that you're seeking. For fermented foods, they don't need to contain live microbes at all. And you mentioned some fermented dairy like yogurts will contain a high number. But it's also a full food, right? So you're getting not just the microbes, you're also getting the metabolites of those microbes and, frankly, the calories, right? And other components. So it's important to have those kinds of foods as a part of a healthy diet. And that may be enough. But if you're looking for maybe some digestive benefits, you may want to try some other preparation. And the thing with probiotics, at least those coming from reputable companies, they will have done randomized controlled trials for a health outcome, and that could be the start to address whatever kind of health issue that you're trying to address.
So what you're saying is that if you wanted to try fermented food, then that's absolutely fine. It's got a good, safety profile. But if you want a specific condition, if you're looking at treating a specific condition, then you might want to look at the evidence-based, the evidence behind a specific probiotic. So presumably you'll know that, I imagine the numbers in kefir, for example, vary widely. So if you want a specific number and strain of bacteria that have been proven to have a particular use in a particular condition, then you might want to look at the probiotic. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as you said, fermented foods are generally not made to provide a health benefit. They're made to taste good. And you mentioned safety. If folks are making it at home, they have to be very careful to, especially like a fermented fruit or vegetable, that it is reaching a very low pH, because people have gotten sick from improperly made fermented foods. So these are just considerations. Food is food, and we eat it for enjoyment. We eat it for nutrition, for many different reasons. So I could see a future where we're making fermented foods for a health benefit, but we don't really do that now.
Yeah, okay. So I give lots of talks at schools, and they always kind of go yuck when I talk about microbes in and on food. I wonder if you could just explain to the listeners, what's the difference between, food spoiling or going rotten because of bacterial growth and fermented food? Some people find that difficult to think about.
Yeah, fermented food really is just a very desired type of spoiled food. Of course, we want to make sure that the food is safe. The acidity is important in fermented fruits and vegetables, or making a fermented meat. That's something to be very careful with. But for instance, a strawberry that has mold on it does not look good to me. And I don't think anyone would call it a fermented food, but if it was a desired type of end product or type of food, then we could call it that. The thing is, all over the world, we have people making just thousands of different kinds of fermented foods, using the ingredients that are available where they live. And so what I might call spoiled, others might call delicious.
Absolutely. So I suppose it's the same as every, cook. You have to follow a recipe, and there are various things that you have to avoid when you're dealing with chicken or poultry or various other ingredients. So you're talking about following a deliberate recipe in a controlled way, in a safe way, and then monitoring things like pH. So you don't want to be just guessing at home. You want to be following, there's lots of very good signposts, which I'll leave to good places and websites where you can follow recipes for this, because it is a lovely thing to do. And certainly people, as you say, with sourdough bread and kombucha, people seem to be really enjoying this. It seems to have captured the public's imagination. Why do you think that is? Give us a little bit of a historical context and why you feel there's this resurgence in interest in this area.
Well, our ancestors have fermented foods, right? This is a great example, not even that long ago, and still in parts of the world, the drinking beer is safer than drinking water. So safety has been a big reason. Preservation, allowing cabbage to last longer than a month, right? And important on journeys before there was refrigeration. Today, I think a lot of interest is like personalization. We go to buy a coffee and we put our special milk in it or special flavorings. And fermentation allows that just a diversification and personalization, like all of the different cheeses and kefir and kombucha. It really expands the kind of foods available to us. I'm really excited about all of these kinds of fermented foods that we could be bringing into our diets. And then you mentioned the health, right? The health benefits. And that's where, again, I think there is a lot of interest in these microbial activities. And I believe it, because we see not just this enrichment of friendly microbes in these foods, but also what they're making, kind of metabolites or breakdown of the fibers, or to make them more digestible for us. And that is pretty cool, because a lot of the microbes in our digestive tract that live there do those sorts of things. So we're starting to see a connection and a lot of kind of personal experiences eating sourdough bread, for example, as being better tolerated. So that's just one, but there's many others of how these foods can be good for us. It's just we're missing those clinical pieces to, I think, bring it home.
Can we dig a bit deeper there? You talked about food being better tolerated. Could you talk about sourdough bread and perhaps kefir? In what way are they better tolerated, and why is that?
Yeah, so when microbes are growing in the flour, right, we have the yeast and the lactic acid bacteria, and putting them together allows a better digestion of the sugars, the carbohydrates that can cause digestive problems. And you also have, I understand, kind of some preliminary evidence that there could be better tolerant people who are less tolerant to gluten. I wouldn't say celiac, because that's a different condition, but, glucose or gluten intolerance. And, I suppose the same could be said for kefir, a traditional kefir, where you have the additional microbes in there besides just in yogurt. But between yogurt and kefir, you also have just reduction in lactose for those who are going to have trouble tolerating lactose.
Okay. So just briefly, I wanted to mention this lovely review that you did on dairy products, because in this fermented food consensus paper, you did say that there was a lack of randomized controlled trials. And this paper that you did, I'm just trying to find it now. It was the impact of fermented dairy on the gastrointestinal health and associated biomarkers. That was 2026 Nutrition Reviews. That was by your team. And I think you looked at 21 studies, half of which showed no impact on health, and I think half which did seem to improve one or more aspects of health. Have things moved on? Is there a lot of research being done here? And what benefits did you find?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually the origin story for the gut health consensus panel, because we were interested to see if fermented dairy foods impacted gut health, and that started the journey because I didn't know what kind of clinical studies to include. So we ended up, selecting studies that included symptom measurements as well as biomarker measurements like the gut microbiome, short-chain fatty acids, gut barrier function, immunity, changes like in immune responses or immune biomarkers. And we included as many different studies as we could find, from children to adults, healthy to underlying conditions. And what impressed me, I think, the most is that the symptoms were improved in majority of the studies. And that, of course, many different symptoms. The digestive symptoms being like prominent. And I wasn't really expecting that. And the other thing I want to point about this paper is that we tried to look beyond just probiotics, because we know a lot of probiotic clinical studies in putting the probiotic into a yogurt or a fermented milk. And we didn't want to make that comparison. We just wanted to look at fermented dairy as a category compared to milk or not having dairy at all. And so I see that as a step forward to show that it's just having fermented dairy. We don't necessarily need to have that probiotic added just to have a benefit.
So I like that we started talking about the gut health paper, and then we moved on to fermented food, and then we've almost come to one of your latest papers to show perhaps how your gut health paper has informed the way that researchers will look at how you measure gut health, because in people's minds, it's just, do I have good gut health or don't I? Whereas what you're saying is there's lots of different domains and lots of different potential biomarkers, and hopefully more biomarkers will be discovered, which are will help us unpack this area. But it's very, very complex. And I suppose when I looked at your website, you talk a lot about systems biology approaches. Can you say a little bit about that? Because very much in my medical training, it was very reductionist and very sort of A moves to B, moves to C. Can you explain to the listeners, to help them understand how complex this is and why we can't come up with one answer, how this works in a systems biology approach?
Yeah, sure. And I really like how you pulled out that really we need to, in our clinical studies or research, to say what domain we're looking at or what is our goal. So I really hope that to be a future for how we look at gut health is I'm going to look at this domain. It's going to be hard to look at all. And that's in our work right now, we're busy with a human study on kimchi.
Wonderful. Tell me more.
Yeah. So we are recruiting folks to eat kimchi for 3 weeks or eat Napa cabbage for 3 weeks. And we're measuring the gut microbiome and biomarkers of gut barrier function and immune response. So that's a really holistic approach.
Yeah, just remind people what kimchi is, and also just explain to people the fact you had to find a control and how that works.
So kimchi is a fermented cabbage, usually with Napa cabbage, and can be radish and other vegetables added, sometimes with fish. It is eaten all the time in Korea. And So we can make it here, but again, follow a good recipe to do that and make sure you have an acidic food. So we needed to have another group to compare to, and we decided to compare to people eating Napa cabbage, which is the base of that food and the majority of the fiber. Because we can expect that having this additional fiber in our diets could change the gut microbiome. And what we hope to learn is whether the kimchi with the fermentation and the microbes in there can change the gut microbiome differently than if we just have the fiber in the cabbage.
I just wanted to ask a couple of things about this trial, which sounds fantastic. So it's a 3-week trial. You've got 2 arms. You've got those taking kimchi. I just wanted to ask how much they're taking a day and if they were used to it. And do you have to, is it healthy volunteers? Do you have to break them in slowly? What's their general fiber intake? Things like that.
Great questions. So we were hoping to bring in folks who don't eat kimchi every day. There's a reason for this is the studies that have been done on kimchi have been mainly done in Korea, where, again, kimchi is just a staple of the diet. And there they found some preliminary evidence that kimchi can be helpful for maintaining weight, reducing adiposity. And so we wanted to see in the population here, like in the US, where kimchi is starting to become more popular, but there's still very few are eating it, is if it could help people who are overweight. So that's what we want to, people we want to include would be people who have a BMI over 25. And 3 weeks is not a long time, so we're not expecting a transformation, but we're hoping to see some clues that could lead us to a larger follow-up study that will allow us to really tackle that question. What's important to say is that this study is being kind of replicated in South Korea. And what we hope to do in a systems biology approach is take the data that we're collecting here and compare it to what they're doing in Korea, what they find, and see if there's maybe geographical differences or similarities. Is there a common response?
Wonderful. Just, I want the listeners to be aware of how complex the scientific method is, how laborious it is, how costly it is. Can you, for something that some people might consider a simple study, because people ask me all the time, why don't they compare this fermented food with that fermented food? Can you just give us an overview of the amount of work, the number of people that went in and the time that went into doing this relatively small study? You haven't told me how many people are how many participants there are, how long it would take, and also the sort of average costs of a very small study so that they can understand, and also the time frame, how long from deciding you're going to do a study and planning it to the actual, results coming out, and then you have to, try and get it published. I just want people to be aware of how much work goes into all this science.
It's a great question. And it's about a 4-year project and approximately $500,000 for 30 people in each arm.
Wow.
So 60. And that doesn't, maybe even describe the costs it is to analyze all these data. And we have a team of 4 people working on it, and to do the microbiome analysis in a deep way, which we want to do, right, adds to the cost. So again, this is a pretty small study, but human studies are expensive, but we need them, right? This is kind of where we get around to, in baseball term, back to home, around the bases to get back to home base. And along the way, we're doing the mechanistic studies of like, how could this kimchi make a difference? What is it doing? And that's the other part of my lab, is thinking about how could these microbes or these foods confer a change in our health.
Yeah. So listeners, remember that this small study, $500,000, 4 years, 4 people. This is a conservative estimate. It's not even starting to take account of lots of other work that goes into this. So if you're asking me why they haven't done, a study on this fermented food, you now understand. If anyone out there has a few $1 million they would like to offer to the Marco Lab, I'm sure Maria would very much like to hear from them. I think it's just really important for people to know that this is meticulous research, and it's very, very specific the way it's done. It has to be very exacting. And I think one of the reasons why people get confused about different messages they get about food research and nutrition research is because and I put myself in that category, we have no idea of the intricacies and the complexities of what you do. Give us an idea of the day in the life of Professor Marco. And I know that a lot of it will be doing, looking for funding for all these studies. Tell me how it works for you in your lab. What does your lab look like, and how many people have you got there?
A really important part of my job is training next generation scientists, and it's really an apprenticeship, right? To learn this trade, which can't be written down in many ways, because it's like many jobs, right? You have to know the ins and outs, and asking scientific questions, how to frame a question, what kind of experiments would be done, and then how to write it up. It's, I think, something that a lot of folks who are not in academics or, doing research, it's hard to explain. So a lot of my day is talking to my students, training. I have postdocs which have PhDs and are on to the next phase and going towards independence. And then undergraduate students and graduate students. And we meet and we talk and think about what the experiment should be and how to interpret the results. And then, as you pointed out, another important part of my day is figuring out how I'm going to support everybody. So that's what keeps me up at night, because I really enjoy what I do. And I think the training the next generation of scientists is really the charge, of course, and contributing to the broader knowledge of what we know about fermented foods and the gut microbiome and probiotics and so on.
I love that, Maria. I've never heard it described quite like that. So it's like a craft, an artisan craft you're talking about. Maybe it's because you're working with, fermented food producers. You're talking of it like an apprenticeship, a trade that you learn over decades that can't be written down. That's kind of very artistic and a lovely way of thinking about it. That you have to experience this over a long period of time to really deeply understand it. And I'm pleased that you've communicated that so well, because I do think that we outside this area don't fully understand all the complexities. And honestly, your work is fantastic. What you're doing with fermented food, what you're doing at ISAPP, what you're doing at the Marco Lab is actually wonderful. And I really want to thank you for your time. I've learned so much from talking to you. Can I just ask you, what excites you? What's obviously the kimchi, the results of the kimchi research is going to be lovely, and hopefully that will expand. What excites you about the future, and where do you see this area going?
Yeah, I really see this convergence between what we are learning about our gut microbes, our digestive tract microbes, and the microbes in foods and fermented foods is kind of coming together. And that is going to be so important for prevention, so disease prevention, and making foods that are delivering the right kinds of metabolites to our bodies. But also can be new therapeutics that target specific microbes in our digestive tract. So from food all the way to pharma is what I'm saying. So I think we have the momentum. We're getting the right kind of level of detail in what's happening, particularly in the lower part of our digestive tract. But that's going to be moving up, and we're going to learn a lot more in the next few years. Of course, funding will depend on how far that goes, but I really am excited about this convergence I see between foods and the gut.
I mean, I really look forward to this research, but again, as a lifestyle medic, I want to get started now. What advice would you give people if they want to, inverted commas, think about their gut health without doing any tests? What are the sort of sensible things that everyone can get started on now? And it does seem there's a reasonable amount of agreement among microbiome scientists that we can get cracking. We don't have to wait for the latest probiotic or the latest research. Do you think there is good evidence? I mean, what would you suggest?
Yeah, and I'm going to be really boring and probably frustrating. And I'm just going to say what we already know. Try to get good sleep. Try to have a healthy diet. Those things are so hard, right? So I'm very sympathetic to it. Sneak in a little bit of more fiber wherever you can. Try to have more yogurt or cheese or things that taste good, but have benefits. And sorry to be boring, but this is really where a lot of the sound advice comes back, and we need to practice, because what's good for our bodies, we know, is also good for our gut microbiome.
Well, I think that's fabulous advice, and it's not boring at all, because what we're talking about is those things which we thought were good for our health. We've now got science that's really backing that up, and I think we should shout it from the rooftops. You're talking about, fiber, increase your fiber, your plant-based whole food, plant-based foods, increase fermented foods, try and get that diversity in. And what you're saying is not boring. It's actually science-backed, incredibly effective, available, and something that we could all get started on now. So I think that's fantastic news that you're saying that we all have the power to, hopefully improve our gut health, even if we're not actually measuring it. And, we look forward to seeing what the science shows us. Well, Maria, thank you so much. It's been incredible. As I've said already, what you're doing is incredible. And maybe when you've done your kimchi research and have the results, we'd love you to come back on and tell us about it.
Yeah, I'd love that. Thank you.
All right. You take care. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Microbiome Medics podcast. We really hope you enjoyed the content, and we welcome your feedback. We'd love to hear any suggestions you might have for microbiome topics that you'd like us to cover. And we also appreciate listeners' questions, and we'll endeavour to answer them in the next podcast.